The sky over the Texas Panhandle had been weeping for 3 days straight, turning the hard-packed earth into a treacherous sea of mud. For Caleb McAllister, a man more comfortable with the silence of the plains than the company of people the deluge was just another hardship to be endured. He was riding west, leaving a past he'd sooner forget buried back in Arkansas. But the land holds its own secrets, and on that grey afternoon, a sound cut through the rhythm of the rain, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a desperate human whimper, and it was coming from the ground itself. Caleb Cal McAllister pulled back on the reins of his bay gelding Shadow, the horse's hooves making sucking sounds in the thick red mud. The relentless downpour had plastered his worn duster to his shoulders and dripped from the brim of his hat in a steady curtain. For 2 years he had been drifting a ghost on the prairie ever since he'd unpinned the U.S. Marshal's badge from his chest. The justice he'd once believed in had proven to be as malleable as this mud shaped by the hands of wealthy, powerful men. So he rode seeking nothing more than the horizon and the hope of a quiet life somewhere in California. That's when he heard it. At first he dismissed it as a trick of the wind whipping through a narrow arroyo. But it came again, fainter this time, a fragile thread of sound nearly lost in the storm's cacophony. It was a cry choked and weak. Cal was a man who had learned to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming that something was profoundly wrong. He dismounted his boots, sinking deep into the mire. "Hello," he called out, his voice a low rumble swallowed by the elements. Silence. Then another whimper, closer now. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the washed-out landscape. The rain had caused a small mudslide from a nearby bluff, creating a chaotic fan of debris, uprooted sagebrush, and slick clay-heavy earth. His gaze caught on something out of place, a patch of stark white lace, like a delicate flower blooming in a bog. As he drew nearer, the horrifying reality snapped into focus. It wasn't just lace. It was the collar of a wedding dress. And beneath it, a woman's head tilted at an unnatural angle was all that was visible above the suffocating mud. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her dark hair was fanned out, matted into the slurry. She was buried alive up to her chin, the immense weight of the wet earth pressing in on her from all sides. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Cal just stood there, a cold dread washing over him that had nothing to do with the rain. This was no accident. The placement was too deliberate, the area around her too trampled by boots that weren't her own. This was an execution, slow and cruel. The training from his past life kicked in, shoving the shock aside. He dropped to his knees, his hands immediately going to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against his fingertips. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. A fragile drumbeat of defiance against a muddy grave. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he said, his voice urgent but steady. "You're going to be all right. I'm going to get you out." Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing irises the color of mossy river stones, clouded with terror and exhaustion. A soft guttural sound escaped her lips, a mix of a sob and a plea. "Don't you try to talk," Cal commanded gently. "Save your strength." He knew he couldn't just pull her out. The suction of the mud could break her bones, or the pressure could crush her. He needed to dig. His hands were his only tools. He clawed at the thick, cold clay around her shoulders, grunting with the effort. It was like digging in wet cement. For every handful he removed, more slurry would ooze back into its place. The rain was his enemy, making the ground heavier, colder. He worked frantically, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The mud clung to him, covering him from his wrists to his elbows. He saw the fine details of her dress now, the intricate pearl beading on the bodice, a mockery of a celebration that had turned into a nightmare. Who would do this? What kind of monster would leave a bride to die in such a way? As he cleared the mud away from her upper chest, he heard her take a slightly deeper breath. It spurred him on. He worked faster, his muscles screaming in protest. He could feel the cold seeping into his own bones, but the thought of the cold she must be enduring fueled his resolve. He wasn't just digging her out of the mud. He was fighting the cruelty of the world he had tried to escape. Finally, after what felt like an hour of grueling, desperate labor, he had cleared enough earth to get his arms around her torso. "All right, ma'am," he panted, positioning himself. "When I lift, I want you to use whatever strength you have and try to push with your legs. Understand?" She gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. "On 3, he said, taking a deep, bracing breath. 1, 2, 3. With a roar of Eirtion that tore from his throat, he heaved upwards. Shadow, his loyal horse, whinnied nervously from a few feet away, sensing the life or death struggle. The mud fought back with a greedy, sucking sound. He felt a sickening pop, and for a terrifying second he thought he'd broken something. But then she was free. She came out of the earth in a single fluid motion, a sodden, shivering heap in his arms. The wedding dress was ruined, a heavy shroud of brown muck. She was limp, her head lolling against his shoulder as consciousness finally abandoned her. He carried her away from the muddy pit that had nearly been her tomb, his own exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. He laid her gently on a patch of grass. The rain hadn't yet turned to soup. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was icy to the touch. Hypothermia was setting in. She wouldn't last much longer out here. Looking around the desolate landscape, he saw no sign of a settlement. He was alone with a half-dead woman in a wedding dress, a storm raging around them, and the chilling knowledge that a monster was somewhere out there on the prairie. He carefully wrapped her in his bedroll from Shadow's pack, cocooning her in the dry wool. Lifting her slight form, he placed her in the saddle before mounting behind her, holding her securely against his chest. "Easy, Shadow," he murmured, urging the horse forward. "Let's find some cover." As they rode into the deepening gloom, Cal held the unconscious woman close. He was a man running from his past, seeking solitude. But fate in its own brutal way had just thrown another soul into his path. He had rescued a bride from the mud, a complete stranger. He had no way of knowing that in saving her life, he had just irrevocably shattered his own hard-won peace and set his feet on a path far more dangerous than the one he'd left behind. Cal found shelter in a place he knew from a previous life spent chasing outlaws, a small line shack nestled in a rocky overhang and long since abandoned by the ranchers who built it. It wasn't much, 4 crumbling walls and a roof that leaked in only 3 places, but it was sanctuary from the biting wind and relentless rain. He carried the woman inside and laid her down on the dusty cot, her shivering now, a violent, uncontrollable shuddering. Her lips were blue. He worked with a grim efficiency that belied the turmoil in his mind. First, a fire. He used the dry kindling he always carried in his saddlebags, and soon a small, hungry flame licked at the damp wood he gathered from a corner of the shack. Next came the dress. The mud-caked garment was a death sentence, leaching the warmth from her body. There was no delicacy in it. He took his knife and carefully slit the beautiful ruined fabric from her ankles to her neck, peeling it away from her frigid skin. Beneath it, she wore a simple chemise and pantalettes equally soaked and soiled. He cut those away too, his movements swift and impersonal, his focus solely on survival. For a moment, her pale, vulnerable form lay exposed in the firelight, crisscrossed with bruises and scrapes. He quickly wrapped her in the last of his dry blankets, tucking it tightly around her. He spent the next few hours in a constant, repetitive cycle. He'd heat water from his canteen in his small tin pot, soak a spare rag and press the warmth against her neck, her wrists, her feet. Anything to coax the life back into her frozen limbs. He forced sips of the warm water between her lips, watching her throat for the faint sign of a swallow. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to the quiet companionship of his horse and the vast emptiness of the plains. Now the tiny shack felt crowded with the fragile presence of this woman. He watched the firelight play across her face, illuminating the sharp line of her jaw, the dark sweep of her lashes against her pale cheek. Questions gnawed at him. Who was she? And who was the man who had loved her enough to propose marriage only to hate her enough to bury her alive? Sometime after midnight, the storm broke, and an exhausted silence fell over the land. It was in that silence that she finally stirred. Her eyes opened not with the clouded terror of before, but with a dawning, horrified awareness. They darted around the small shack, taking in the strange surroundings, the flickering fire, and finally the bearded stranger watching her from a stool. A raw cry of fear escaped her lips, and she tried to scramble away, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Easy now," Cal said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe. I'm the one who pulled you from the mud." Her moss-green eyes were wide, filled with a primal terror that made his chest ache. Where am I? Who are you?" Her voice was a hoarse whisper, raw from the cold and the screaming he hadn't heard. "Name's Cal. Caleb McAllister. This is just an old line shack. You're safe here," he repeated, keeping his voice low and calm. "I found you about 6 miles east of here. You were buried." The word hung in the air between them. Her face crumpled, the memory crashing back into her with the force of a physical blow. Sobs racked her body, deep tearing sounds of grief and terror. Cal sat still, giving her space, letting the storm inside her rage as the one outside had. He was no good with tears, no good with comfort. All he could offer was his quiet, unthreatening presence. When the sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she looked at him again, a new emotion mingling with the fear in her eyes' resolve. "My name is Isabella," she said, her voice stronger now. "Isabella Rossi." The name sounded foreign, lyrical. It didn't fit the harsh landscape of West Texas. "Isabella," he repeated softly. "Can you tell me what happened? Who did that to you?" She took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames as if the memory were playing out within them. "It was the day of my wedding," she began, her voice trembling. "I was supposed to marry Marcus Vance." The name meant nothing to Cal, but he filed it away. "Marcus," she continued, a bitter chill in her tone, "is the most respected man in Redemption Creek. He owns the biggest ranch the Mercantile has the sheriff in his pocket. He's charming, generous, a pillar of the community." She spat the last words like poison. "And he is a monster." She told him everything then, the words spilling out in a torrent. She was an orphan raised in a convent in San Antonio, brought to Redemption Creek by a matchmaker. Marcus Vance had seemed like a dream, handsome, wealthy, promising her a life of comfort and security. But in the weeks leading up to the wedding, she'd seen flashes of a different man. A coldness in his eyes when a ranch hand made a mistake, a cruel smirk when he spoke of a homesteader whose luck had run out. The day before the wedding, Isabella said, her hands clenching the blanket, "I was looking for some ribbon in his study. I found his private ledger. It wasn't hidden, he was just that arrogant. He thought no one would dare that I couldn't read." She gave a humorless laugh. "The sisters in the convent taught me well. It was all there, Cal. Every last dirty deal." She explained the scheme. Vance was systematically bankrupting the smaller landowners in the valley. He'd sell them cattle on credit that he knew were carrying fever dam a stream to dry out their crops or have his men rustle their stock. When they couldn't make their payments, he'd foreclose, buying their land for pennies on the dollar. The ledger was a meticulous record of his cruelty, with names, dates, and profits. "I confronted him," she whispered, shame and anger warring in her voice. "I told him I couldn't marry a man like him. I told him I would expose him." Her eyes met Cal's, and he saw the reflection of her horrifying memory. "He smiled," she said, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "He told me I was more clever than he thought, and that it was a pity. Then his men, they grabbed me. They held me down while he told me that since I loved the land so much, I could become a permanent part of it. He said the storm would wash away any evidence. By the time anyone found me, if they ever did, I'd just be another poor soul who got caught in a mudslide." Silence descended on the shack once more, thick and heavy with the weight of her story. Cal felt a cold, familiar anger coiling in his gut. It was the same brand of injustice he had witnessed as a marshal, the powerful preying on the weak, cloaking their villainy in respectability. He had run from it once, but now it had found him in the form of a half-dead woman in a ruined wedding dress. "This man, Marcus Vance," Cal said, his voice a low growl. "This town, Redemption Creek. How far is it?" "A day's ride north, maybe," she answered, watching him. She saw the shift in him, the quiet drifter hardening into something else, something dangerous. "What are you going to do?" He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the stars that were now scattered across the cleared sky like spilled diamonds. He had wanted a quiet life. He had wanted to leave this all behind. But looking at Isabella, so fragile, yet so fierce, he knew he couldn't ride away and leave her to this fate. He couldn't leave a man like Vance to continue his reign of terror. To do so would be to betray the last shred of the man he used to be. "First," he said, turning back to face her, his decision made, "we get your strength back. Then we ride to Redemption Creek. A man who keeps a record of his sins deserves to have them read aloud." In that moment, Isabella saw past the grime and the beard of the stranger who had saved her. She saw a protector, an avenger. And for the first time since she'd felt the cold mud closing in around her, she felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know anything about Caleb McAllister, but she knew he was her only chance at justice. 2 days later, they rode into Redemption Creek under a clear, unforgiving sun. The town was deceptively pleasant. A single dusty main street lined with clapboard buildings, a saloon, a smithy, a church, and the prominent 2-story Vance Mercantile. It looked peaceful, prosperous, but Cal could feel the tension humming beneath the surface, the same way a man can feel the pressure change before a storm. He saw it in the way people averted their eyes, the way conversations stopped when they rode past. Isabella, dressed in a spare shirt and trousers Cal had provided, rode beside him, her face pale but set with determination. She had regained her physical strength, but the emotional toll of their return was evident in the tight grip she kept on her reins. "The sheriff's office is at the end of the street," she said, her voice low. The sheriff's office was a small, squat building with a single barred window. A weathered sign swung creaking in the breeze. As they dismounted, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his late 50s with a drooping mustache and a weary face. A tin star was pinned crookedly to his vest. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his eyes lingering on Cal with suspicion. "Sheriff Brody," Cal asked. "That's me. My name is Caleb McAllister. This is Isabella Rossi. She has a crime to report." At the mention of Isabella's name, a flicker of recognition and something akin to panic crossed the sheriff's face. He ushered them inside, quickly closing the door behind them. The office was cluttered and smelled of stale cigar smoke. "Isabella Rossi," Sheriff Brody repeated, rubbing his tired eyes. "Mr. Vance has had the whole county out looking for you. He's been worried sick. Said you ran off right before the wedding. Had some kind of fit of nerves." Isabella stepped forward, her voice ringing with indignation. "I didn't run off, Sheriff. I was taken. Marcus Vance tried to murder me." She recounted the story again, her voice clear and steady, leaving out no detail: the ledger, the confrontation, his men, the mud. As she spoke, Cal watched Sheriff Brody's face. The man didn't look shocked or outraged. He looked pained, cornered. He kept glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to appear. When she finished, Brody sighed heavily and sank into his chair. "Ma'am, that's a mighty serious accusation to make against a man like Mr. Vance." "It's the truth," she insisted. "Look, I've known Marcus Vance for 10 years, Brody said, his tone placating. "He's a pillar of this community, a generous man. Maybe you had a fight, got upset, wandered off into the storm, and got turned around. The mind can play tricks on you when you're scared and cold." "Are you calling me a liar?" Isabella's voice cracked with disbelief. "He's calling you a hysterical woman." Cal interjected, his voice flat and cold. "He's not going to help us." The door to the office swung open with a bang, and all three of them turned. Framed in the doorway stood a man who radiated wealth and power. He was tall and handsome, in a severe sort of way, dressed in a tailored black suit. His hair was perfectly combed, and his smile was a dazzling, predatory thing. It didn't reach his cold grey eyes. "Isabella, my dear." "Marcus Vance," exclaimed his voice, a rich baritone filled with feigned relief. He rushed forward, his arms outstretched. "Thank God you're safe. I've been out of my mind with worry." Isabella recoiled, as if he were a snake. "Don't you touch me," she hissed. Vance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he turned it into a look of pained confusion. He looked at the sheriff, then at Cal. "What is the meaning of this, Sheriff? Who is this man, Isabella darling? What's wrong? She's been telling me some wild stories, Marcus," Sheriff Brody said, refusing to meet Vance's gaze. "Wild stories." Vance's eyes settled on Isabella, and for a moment the charming mask slipped. Cal saw a flash of pure, murderous rage there, so potent it was almost visible. Then it was gone, replaced by a look of deep concern. "Oh, my poor girl. The storm must have terrified you. You're not well." He turned to Cal. "And you, sir. I suppose I should thank you for finding her, but I'll take it from here. She's my fiancée. She needs a doctor and rest." He made to take Isabella's arm, but Cal stepped between them, his body a solid, immovable wall. The two men were of a similar height, but where Vance was polished and manicured, Cal was raw and weathered, like he'd been carved from the unforgiving land itself. "She's not going anywhere with you," Cal said, his voice a low warning. Vance's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to say?" "Just a man who doesn't like seeing women used as planting material," Cal replied. The subtle jab hit its mark. A muscle twitched in Vance's jaw. "Sheriff Vance," said, his voice losing its velvet edge and taking on the hard glint of steel, "this drifter is interfering. He's clearly filled my poor Isabella's head with nonsense. I want him arrested for vagrancy, and I am taking my fiancée home." Sheriff Brody stood up, his hand hovering uncertainly near the Colt at his hip. He was trapped between a terrifying accusation and the most powerful man in the county. His fear made the decision for him. "Son," Brody said, his gaze fixed on Cal, "you heard Mr. Vance. It's time for you to move on. Let the lady go with her intended." "No," Isabella cried out, grabbing onto Cal's arm. "Don't leave me with him." Cal looked from Isabella's terrified face to Vance's triumphant smirk, to Brody's pathetic cowardice. He knew this was a losing fight. In this town, Vance was the law. Pushing it now would only land him in a cell, and Isabella right back in the hands of the man who tried to kill her. "All right, Sheriff," Cal said, slowly. His eyes locked on Vance. "We'll leave." He gently pried Isabella's fingers from his arm. "But we're leaving together." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I don't think so. Isabella stays. She's a free woman. She can go where she pleases," Cal countered, "and right now she's choosing to please go with me, unless you plan on having the sheriff here arrest her for her own attempted murder." The logic was undeniable, and it put Brody in an even more impossible position. The sheriff deflated, looking helplessly at Vance. Vance's face was a thundercloud. He had underestimated the drifter. He had expected a simple cowpoke, not someone with a backbone of iron. "This isn't over," Vance snarled at Cal, the pretense of the concerned fiancé completely gone. "This town, this valley, it's mine. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I'm starting to get a pretty good idea," Cal said calmly. He took Isabella's arm and guided her toward the door. Every eye in the street was on them now, the townsfolk peering from behind curtains and doorways, sensing the confrontation. As they stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Cal knew Vance's threat was not an idle one. They had walked into the lion's den, poked the lion, and walked back out. The lion would not be pleased. They were marked now. Every road out of Redemption Creek would be watched. Every shadow could hold one of Vance's men. They had won the standoff, but in doing so, they had just declared war. And in a war against a man who owned a town, they were hopelessly outgunned. They rode out of Redemption Creek not as victors, but as fugitives. Cal didn't follow the main trail west. It would be the first place Vance's men would look. Instead, he cut south into the rugged, broken country of the canyons, a maze of stone and shadow, where a man could disappear if he knew the land. And Cal knew the land. They made a cold camp that night in a narrow box canyon with towering walls of red rock on 3 sides, offering a defensible position. The fire was small, shielded from view. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the tentative silence of strangers, but the weighted silence of allies, bound by a common enemy. "He won't stop," Isabella said, staring into the flames. "He'll send his men. He can't let me live, not now." "He won't find us here," Cal said, cleaning his Remington pistol by the firelight, the metallic clicks echoing in the quiet canyon. Not for a while, at least. But we can't run forever. A man like Vance doesn't give up on a threat. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice laced with despair. "My word against his means nothing. That sheriff is his dog. We have no proof." "The ledger," Cal said, looking up at her. "You said he kept a ledger." "Yes." She nodded. "In his study, in a locked drawer of his big oak desk. That's the proof. It names names, dates, everything. If the right people saw that, the right people aren't in Redemption Creek." Cal finished for her. "We'd have to get it to a federal marshal or a circuit judge." He fell silent, a thoughtful, grim look on his face. The idea of getting the ledger seemed impossible. Vance's ranch would be a fortress. To break the heavy silence, Isabella asked a question that had been on her mind for days. "Cal, who are you? You're not just a drifter. The way you faced him, the way you handle yourself, it's something else." Cal stopped his work, his hands stilling on the pistol. He rarely spoke of his past. It was a locked room inside him, the door sealed shut. But looking at Isabella, whose own life had been upended by the very corruption he'd fled, he felt a crack appear in that door. "I used to wear a badge," he said quietly, his gaze distant. "U.S. Marshal out of Fort Smith, for nearly 10 years. Isabella's eyes widened. "What happened?" It took a slow breath, the memory still raw. "I worked on a case, a big one. Involved railroad contracts, land fraud, a syndicate of powerful men cheating settlers and the government. They were pillars of the community, just like your Vance, respected, untouchable." He set the pistol down. "We built a case rock solid, had ledgers, witnesses, everything. The night before the trial, our key witness was found dead. Fell from a hotel window, they said. The ledger disappeared from the evidence locker. The judge, a man I'd respected my whole life, dismissed the case for lack of evidence." The bitterness in his voice was a palpable thing. "I found out later the judge's daughter had a sudden, miraculous recovery from a terrible illness, thanks to a specialist from back east. The syndicate had paid her medical bills. They bought him. They bought justice." He looked at his hands. "I couldn't wear the star after that. If the law was just another commodity for the rich to buy and sell, I wanted no part of it. So I left. Been drifting since." Isabella listened, her heart aching for him. His disillusionment mirrored her own. "The names in Vance's ledger." She began slowly trying to recall the details she'd only glimpsed. "They were mostly local homesteaders. But there were other entries. Payments, large sums sent to accounts. One name I remember was a shipping company, the Argent Corporation, based out of Fort Smith." Cal froze. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air snaked down his spine. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a new intense light. "Argent Corporation." He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she said, confused by his reaction. "Why, Argent Corporation?" Cal said the words, tasting like ash in his mouth, was the financial front for the syndicate I was investigating. They were the ones who paid the judge. The world seemed to shrink around them, the vastness of the prairie collapsing into a single suffocating point of connection. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Marcus Vance wasn't just a local tyrant running a small-time land-grabbing scheme. He was part of it. Part of the same web of corruption that had shattered Cal's faith in the law and sent him running. He hadn't escaped his past at all. He'd ridden right into its heart. The despair that had settled over Cal for 2 years began to burn away, replaced by a cold, hard fire. This was no longer just about helping Isabella. This was about finishing the fight he had abandoned. Vance's ledger wasn't just proof of local crimes. It was the missing link, the key to unraveling the entire syndicate. "He's not just a branch," Cal murmured more to himself than to her. "He's a root." He looked at Isabella, and in that moment, something shifted between them. He saw not a victim he had to protect, but a partner. She held the key not just to her own justice, but to his redemption. And he realized with a startling clarity that his heart, which he had thought long dead and buried, was beating with a fierce protective rhythm every time he looked at her. It wasn't just duty. It was more. He had rescued her from the mud, and in doing so, she had unearthed a part of him he thought he'd lost forever. "We have to go back," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that hadn't been there before. Isabella looked at him, her own fear eclipsed by the strength she drew from his newfound purpose. "Back to Redemption Creek. They'll be looking for us." "Not to the town," he clarified. "To his ranch. Tonight Vance will be celebrating. He'll think he's won, that he's scared us off. He'll be drinking, his guard will be down. There won't be a better time." "You want to break into his house?" she asked, the audacity of the plan taking her breath away. "We need that ledger, Isabella," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "It's the only way. For both of us." She saw the ghosts of his past in his eyes, the weight of the injustice he carried. And she knew he was right. Running was a slow death. Fighting was their only chance at life. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me the plan." Under the vast, starry canvas of the Texas sky, the disillusioned lawman and the condemned bride began to plot a heist. It was a desperate, near-suicidal gamble, but as they spoke, a bond forged in shared trauma, and a thirst for justice hardened into something unbreakable. Cal had set out to steal a ledger, but he knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that Isabella Rossi had already stolen his heart. Vance's ranch was a sprawling monument to his ego, the main house a 2-story behemoth of timber and stone that lorded over the valley. As Cal had predicted, the house was ablaze with light and alive with the sound of music and drunken laughter. Vance was hosting a victory party. Cal and Isabella watched from a rocky outcrop, a 1/4 mile away, the cool night air, a stark contrast to the boiling tension within them. They were both dressed in dark clothing, their faces smudged with dirt for camouflage. "His study is on the ground floor at the back of the house," Isabella whispered, pointing. "The window looks out over the garden. That's our way in. He'll have men posted." Cal noted his eyes scanning the perimeter. He spotted 2 guards patrolling their paths, predictable. "We wait for the patrol to pass the far side, move to the garden wall. I'll go in. You wait by the wall with the horses. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, or if you hear a gunshot, you ride. You ride hard and you don't look back. Promise me." "No," Isabella said firmly, turning to him. The firelight from the distant house danced in her eyes. "We started this together. We finish it together. I know the layout of that house. I know exactly where the ledger is. You'll need me." Cal started to object, but he saw the unyielding steel in her gaze. She was right. She wasn't a liability. She was his best chance of finding the ledger quickly. Arguing would only waste time. "All right," he conceded with a nod. "But you do exactly as I say. No heroics." "The same goes for you, Marshal," she replied with a faint smile. They moved like ghosts through the scrubland, their footsteps silent in the soft dirt. They reached the low stone wall of the garden just as the guards rounded the far corner of the house. With a grunt, Cal vaulted over, then reached back to help Isabella. They crouched in the manicured rose bushes, the scent of the flowers thick and cloying. The study window was unlocked, a testament to Vance's arrogance. Cal slid it open with a faint groan of protest from the wood. He slipped inside, then helped Isabella through. They were in. The room was dark, smelling of leather and cigar smoke. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the massive oak desk that dominated the room. While Cal stood watch by the door, listening to the muffled party sounds from the front of the house, Isabella went straight to the desk. "It's this one," she whispered, pointing to the bottom right drawer. "It's locked." Cal pulled a thin piece of metal from his boot, a lockpick he'd carried for years, a relic from his less savory assignments. He knelt by the desk, his touch surprisingly delicate. He worked for a tense minute, the only sound the faint scratching of metal on metal and the thumping of their own hearts. With a soft click, the lock gave way. Isabella slid the drawer open, and there it was, a thick leather-bound book. She lifted it out, clutching it to her chest as if it were the most precious object in the world. "Let's go," Cal mouthed. They turned back toward the window victory, within their grasp. But just as Cal reached for the sash, the study door swung open, flooding the room with lamplight. Marcus Vance stood there, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, his face a mask of shocked fury. Behind him stood two of his burliest ranch hands. "Well, well," Vance purred, his voice dangerously soft. "The runaway bride and her mongrel savior. I should have known you didn't have the sense to keep running." His eyes fixed on the ledger in Isabella's hands. "I see you came for a souvenir. Give it to me." "It's over, Vance," Cal said, slowly moving to position himself between Vance and Isabella. "This book is going to a judge who can't be bought." Vance laughed, a genuinely amused sound this time. "You think you're the first person to try and bring me down? I am this valley. The law you worship is 1,000 miles away. Here I am, the law." He gestured with his glass. "Kill the drifter. Bring me the girl and the book." The two thugs lunged forward, but they were expecting a simple cowboy, not a trained U.S. Marshal. Cal moved with startling speed. He sidestepped the first man's clumsy punch, grabbed his arm, and used his momentum to throw him head first into the heavy oak desk with a sickening crunch. The second man, seeing his partner go down, pulled a pistol. But before he could aim, Isabella, acting on pure instinct, hurled a heavy inkwell from the desk. It struck the man's gun hand, sending the pistol clattering across the floor and spattering him with dark ink. The momentary distraction was all Cal needed. He closed the distance in 2 long strides and delivered a brutal right cross to the man's jaw, sending him slumping to the floor. It was just Cal and Vance now. Vance's handsome face was twisted in an ugly snarl. He dropped his glass and drew a silver-plated derringer from his coat pocket. "You've ruined everything," he screamed, leveling the small pistol at Cal. Bang! The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, but it wasn't Vance's derringer that had fired. Cal stood unhit, staring past Vance. In the doorway, Sheriff Brody stood with his Colt Peacemaker smoking in his hand. Vance looked down at his own chest, where a dark red stain was blossoming on his pristine white shirt. He looked back at Brody, his expression one of pure disbelief. "Brody, you," he gasped. "I took an oath, Marcus," the old sheriff said, his voice shaking but firm. He'd seen Cal and Isabella sneak onto the property and had followed his conscience, finally winning the war with his fear. An oath to the law, not to you." The commotion had brought the party to a halt. Guests and ranch hands crowded the hallway, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion drawn by the gunshot. They saw the two unconscious thugs, Vance clutching his chest and Sheriff Brody holding the smoking gun. Cal seized the moment. He took the ledger from Isabella's trembling hands, held it high for all to see. "This is what you were fighting for, Vance." Cal's voice boomed through the house. "This is the proof of your crimes. It's all in here. The homesteaders you bankrupted, the families you ruined, men like Arthur Penn, whose cattle you poisoned, like the Sanchez family, whose well you ran dry. It's all in here." He read name after name, the litany of Vance's greed, echoing through the stunned silence. With each name, the townspeople's faces shifted from fear of Vance to anger. These were their neighbors, their friends. Vance, seeing his empire of fear crumbling, made one last, desperate move. With a final surge of adrenaline, he lunged for Isabella, trying to grab her as a hostage. But Cal was ready. He shoved Isabella safely behind him and met Vance's charge, tackling him to the ground. Vance's head struck the corner of the desk with a final, sickening crack. He lay still. Silence descended. Cal rose, breathing heavily, and looked down at the man who had caused so much pain. Then he looked at Isabella, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He went to her, his hands gently framing her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak, and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tightly, the ledger pressed between them. The world outside the circle of their arms fading away. They had done it. They had faced the monster, and won. A month passed, and the harsh Texas sun seemed to shine a little warmer on Redemption Creek. The pall of fear that had suffocated the valley under Marcus Vance's reign had lifted, replaced by the bustling sounds of life and recovery. The change was palpable. Cal saw it in the way neighbors greeted each other on the street, their conversations open and unafraid. He saw it in the renewed determination on the faces of the homesteaders who, with their land titles rightfully restored, now frequented the mercantile, the one Vance no longer owned, to stock up on seed and supplies. One afternoon, Cal watched as the Sanchez family loaded their wagon. Mr. Sanchez, a man whose face had been etched with despair just weeks before, caught Cal's eye. He removed his hat and gave a slow, deep nod of gratitude. No words were needed. Cal returned the nod, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest that felt more real than any commendation he had ever received. He continued down the street and paused outside the sheriff's office. The door was open, and inside Sheriff Brody was mediating a dispute between two ranchers over a stray calf. The old, weary man was gone. In his place was a man who stood straighter, his voice firm but fair, his gaze clear. He had found his courage in the echo of a gunshot, and was now wearing his badge with the pride it deserved. Brody saw Cal and gave him a brief, knowing smile before turning back to his work. The town was healing, and it had found a proper lawman to protect it. The architect of this new era of Justice Circuit, Judge Patterson, had summoned Cal to his temporary chambers at the hotel. He was a stern, righteous man, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. On the table between them lay a brand-new silver star gleaming under the lamplight. "McAllister," the judge began, his voice raspy. "I've read the full report. I've read Vance's ledger. What you and Miss Rosie accomplished here, it was more than just bringing one man to justice. You severed a root of a very poisonous tree. The investigation into the Argent Corporation has been reopened at the highest levels because of what you did. He pushed the star across the table. This territory needs a permanent U.S. Marshal. A man who can't be bought, who understands that the law is more than just words in a book. It needs a man like you. The position is yours if you want it. Cal looked down at the badge. He felt the phantom weight of his old one on his chest. For a moment, he was tempted. The star represented a restoration, a chance to reclaim the identity he had cast off in disgust. He could be that man again, a bulwark against the darkness. But the memories came with it, the corruption, the helplessness, the bitter taste of a justice system that had failed. He thought of the endless paperwork, the political maneuverings, the lonely nights on the trail, chasing ghosts, while the real villains sat in high-backed chairs. Then he thought of Isabella. He thought of the terror in her eyes, turning to fire, of her steady presence at his side, in Vance's study of the simple warmth of her hand in his. That felt more real, more vital than the cold metal of the star. "It's a great honor, Judge," Cal said, finally looking up. "I'll need to think on it." That evening, he met Isabella on the rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. The sun was bleeding across the horizon, setting the clouds ablaze. She was watching the lights of the town begin to twinkle in the dusk. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. "It feels peaceful." "It is," he agreed, standing beside her. He told her then about the judge's offer, about the badge waiting for him on the hotel desk. Her face lit up with genuine happiness for him. "Oh, Cal, that's wonderful. You see, you were meant for it. You brought justice back to this valley. You can do so much good." Her belief in him was a sweet, sharp pang in his chest, but it was a belief in a man he no longer was. "I told him I'd think on it," he said, "but my mind's already made up. I'm turning him down." The smile faded from her face, replaced by confusion. "But why, this is everything you lost. A chance to fight back against men like Vance." He finally turned to face her, fully taking both of her hands in his. "I already did fight back," he said, his voice earnest. "We did, right here. But that badge, that isn't my fight anymore, Isabella. For 2 years I've been riding west, thinking I was running from my past. I wasn't. I was waiting. I just didn't know what for." He looked out at the vast, darkening landscape. "I thought I wanted a quiet life, a place where the law was simple. But what I really want is a life that matters. And what matters isn't a territory on a map. It's this." He squeezed her hands gently. "It's knowing that the people you care for are safe. My jurisdiction, the only one I'm interested in, anymore, is the ground you stand on." He took a deep breath, the words coming from a place he had long kept locked away. "I'm still heading to California. The trail is long, and there are no guarantees of what we'll find there. It won't be easy. But the thought of facing it with you, it makes the whole journey feel like a destination. Isabella Rossi, I'm not asking you to be my bride or to follow me. I'm asking you to be my partner, to build a new life with me on our own terms, under a sky that we choose." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of profound joy. She who had been brought to this place as property, who had nearly been swallowed by its dirt, was now being offered a future as wide as the horizon itself. "Caleb McAllister," she said, her voice thick with emotion but steady and sure. "I have seen what your justice looks like. I have seen what your protection feels like. There is no other future I would want." She smiled, a radiant, brilliant thing that outshone the fading sun. "My home is no longer a place on a map. It's right here, standing next to you. Yes?" My answer is yes. He pulled her into his arms, and the embrace was not one of a rescuer and a victim, but of two equals two survivors who had found their anchor in each other. They stood there for a long time as the last light faded and the stars emerged, two small figures against the immense backdrop of the west. They turned together their backs to the town they had saved and faced the vast open promise of the trail ahead, ready to pioneer not a piece of land, but a life. That, my friends, is the story of Caleb McAllister and Isabella Rossi. A testament to the fact that sometimes the deepest darkness can lead to the brightest dawn. It's a story about how a single act of courage can unravel an empire of deceit, and how a chance encounter on a muddy trail can change the course of two lives forever. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about the badge you wear or the wealth you own, but about the conviction in your heart. If this story of resilience, justice, and unexpected love in the heart of the unforgiving West resonated with you, I'd be truly grateful if you'd take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with a friend who loves a good old-fashioned tale of grit and redemption. And most importantly, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories from the annals of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.